Tonight to take a call on the Taxation, GST and Remedial Matters Bill, but like the Speaker, the member who's just returned her seat, I couldn't, in all good conscience, speak about tax tonight in the House, sir, without just taking a moment to reflect the tragedy that's happened in the country today. I know it's been mentioned before, but having spent the last 3.5 hours now, I guess, watching coverage as it came out of Greymouth, I think everyone in the country is focused on things that are far more important and immediate and real to us than the passing of taxation legislation. And like the member from the Maori Party, can I just take a moment, sir, to express my extreme sorrow and heartbreak for all the miners, their families and the whole community. It's a devastating thing for them to be going through. Sir, we are, however, continuing here in Parliament, and this evening we are addressing this reading of the Taxation, GST and Remedial Matters Bill. And as a member of the Finance and Expenditure Committee, I've had a chance to get to know this bill and work on it as it progressed through Select Committee. And one of the things, sir, that I think has become more apparent to me as I've sat on that committee is that tax, for all its inherent dull, dry and sort of unappealingness to those of us who don't live and breathe it as an occupation, is actually a very dynamic and growing living organism. And one thing I think we can all say quite safely is that, leaving aside policy changes, we'll never have the perfect tax system. I don't think we'll ever be able to say, you know what, we've done it now, we've knocked it off, it's sorted, just don't touch it, it'll be fine. Tax is something that is very biotic almost. It's growing, it's breathing, and day by day we're learning ways we can improve it and make it better. And this bill, I think, is a good, although sort of, just a small example of the things that happen in that space. The GST system, which the majority of this bill focuses on, not all of it, is widely commented on internationally as being an excellent taxation system. It's commented on the simplicity, the ease, and the way it's applied is often the subject of a lot of positive commentary around the world, and I think that's something we should be very proud of. But, harking back to the comment I just made, that's not to say that we have a perfect system by any stretch. And this bill sets out to do a couple of things that we should always be mindful of in the tax system, and one of those is to identify and close down where people are taking advantage of the tax laws. And we've heard both Mr Nash and Ms Cartney speak of the Phoenix transactions that this bill addresses. Sir, I've got to say it's not something I'd actually been aware of in my practice as a property lawyer. I'm very pleased to say that I don't think any of my clients were partaking in that. I certainly wouldn't have been part of it if I'd known what was going on. But clearly it's an issue, and it's one that the IRD have identified. And having identified it, I think it's incumbent on them and on us to do what we can to shut it down, because what we do know is that the vast majority of New Zealanders are working hard, paying their taxes, contributing, and there's not a person in this House who wouldn't support jumping on any New Zealander who seeks to avoid that and exploit the tax system for their own financial gain. And so here's a situation where these evasion schemes have been identified. They are nothing more than a way to rort the tax system, to take money from the Crown, from the Consolidated Fund, from the wealth of every New Zealander that they're not entitled to. And so, of course, there can be no other response but to support a way to crack down on that. Having said that, as a committee, we certainly didn't want to say, good as gold, you've got a problem, whatever you think is fine with us. And I think the committee can be rightly proud of its work, and certainly on a multi-partisan basis. There was no politics in this, to ensure that while we addressed what we needed to crack down on, we didn't do it in a way that, at least to the best of our knowledge and certainly the best of our intentions, that would create further problems or perhaps overreach, because that has been an issue in the past. And in addition to closing loopholes, the other part, I think, of that continual process of evolution of this living, breathing thing we call the tax system is working out ways to make it a bit simpler, a bit easier to understand. I know the Tax Department at the moment, the IRD, is working on the results of a discussion document called Making Tax Easier, and I support them in that, because tax is not a simple thing, and yet we need it to be simple. So there's a continual tension there. But some of the changes that the IRD, through the Minister of Revenue, have brought to this House, I think they're not going to set the world alight, but they are commendable, because they do that exact thing. They try and identify areas where there's been a lot of confusion and it's hard for taxpayers to know what their obligations are, and they've tried to identify it and address them and make them clearer. And we have issues around where assets are used for both taxable and non-taxable purposes. We have issues around the definition or the line between the use of residential accommodation and commercial accommodation. And one, I guess, that is a bit more meaningful to me from the property law game is around the GST rules, where properties are bought as nominee and then there is a subsequent nomination of an eventual purchaser, and just making it very clear from the outset how GST will apply in that situation. And, with this stuff, it's not about massive policy changes of direction. It's really just about making a very simple, clear, easy to understand set of rules so that people going into transactions, Mr. Speaker, can understand, can know what their obligations are up front. And I guess if there's one theme that I'm always harping on about in committee, it's about the obligation of the IRD to make the rules as easy to understand up front as they possibly can, rather than doing the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff stuff. So I'm always very happy to see them working, and will support legislation that encourages them to clear up where there is this confusion. I want New Zealanders to get their tax right first time. I don't want them having to spend a lot of money on lawyers and tax accountants and in disputes with the IRD when they're not deliberately trying to rip off the system. And the aspects of this bill that address those issues, sir, are certainly directed in that regard. The other matter I just want to touch on reasonably briefly in this contribution, because it is a matter that the Select Committee spent a bit of time on, is the issue of the powers of the IRD to take money from joint bank accounts. And we've got an inevitable tension here, because we want the IRD, of course, to have the power to recover tax that is owed to them, and to stop people being able to deliberately avoid the payment of their taxes and their contribution to the running of this wonderful country. But equally, we have to be certain that we don't allow them to operate in a way that has unfair consequences to other parties. So when you're allowing the Inland Revenue Department to help themselves to money from joint bank accounts, we were very concerned on the committee to say, well, look, what are the safeguards there, and how can that work? And we spent a lot of time discussing, and I want to acknowledge actually the Honourable Roger Douglas, who was very concerned about this point and really was the originator of the concern in committee. How do we ensure that that is appropriately exercised? And one of the examples that did concern us was the situation, for example, of a business partnership. A joint partnership can be, a joint bank account could be a lot more than just a husband and wife, mum and dad's cheque account. It could easily be, as it was in my case for many, many years, legal partners operating in partnership through a bank account. And it didn't seem right or appropriate to us that money could be taken out of that account to satisfy the personal tax liability of one partner without the knowledge of the others, particularly where the extent of that partner's share of the bank account could be considerably less than their amount of the debt. So they could be a 1% partner, and yet the whole of the account could be subject to seizure. So that was something we did put to officials on a number of occasions and ask them to come back to us on more than one occasion to make sure we got it right. And I just do want to pay tribute to them, because I think they worked very hard to recognise and satisfy committee concerns in that regard. So, as I said at the outset, who wants to be thinking about tax at a time like this when the country is dealing with what it's dealing with? But for all that, we do have to carry on in this House, and the Taxation, GST and Remedial Matters Bill, I think there's been widespread support for it across the House, and that's as I would expect, because it's about, in essence, ensuring New Zealanders aren't ripping off the tax system, and ensuring good New Zealanders find it as easy as possible to get their tax affairs right first time, every time. And that's certainly, sir, something that I think we can all support. I commend the bill to the House.